7 times. That's how many times the blood had to be sprinkled. Leviticus 16 verse 14 and 16 verses 19 both say it. On the one day each year the high priest entered the most holy place. He didn't sprinkle the blood once and move on. He sprinkled it 7 times before the mercy seat, then 7 more times on the altar outside. The text never explains why 7. Not once. It gives the number and moves straight into the next instruction like the count is obvious. But it isn't. A single sprinkling would have marked the blood as present. 7 sprinklings is something else entirely, and most sermons never even mention the number exists. This isn't a small detail buried in a genealogy. This is the one day a year Israel's entire relationship with God got reset, and God cared enough to specify a count. By the end of this, you'll see exactly what that number was protecting. Most people who've heard of Leviticus 16 knows it as the Day of Atonement chapter and leaves it there. Sermons summarize it in one line. The high priest sacrificed an animal, and Israel's sins were forgiven for another year. Illustration Bibles show a robed figure and a bowl of blood and call it done. That summary isn't wrong. It's just thin. Leviticus 16 is one of the most tightly ordered chapters in the entire Torah, and almost none of that order survives the retelling. Who gets purified first? What happens before the blood is even collected? Why does one animal die and another one doesn't? So this time we're reading it slowly, rule by rule, in the order the text actually gives them. And here's the claim worth holding on to as we go. These details don't just describe a ritual. Together, they spell out exactly how God feels about blood, and that pattern doesn't fully resolve for another 15 centuries. To understand Leviticus 16, you have to understand what it's responding to. 2 chapters earlier, in Leviticus 10, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, walked into the presence of God carrying unauthorized fire, something God had not commanded. Fire came out and killed them both on the spot inside the sacred space. Leviticus 16 opens by referencing that exact event. This isn't a chapter written in the abstract. It's written in the shadow of 2 deaths that happened because someone treated God's presence casually. That's the weight sitting over everything that follows. Israel is camped around a portable sanctuary called the tabernacle. At its center is a room called the Most Holy Place, and inside that room sits the Ark of the Covenant, covered by a lid called the mercy seat. God's presence meets Israel there. But that presence is not safe to approach carelessly. It is holy in the fullest sense, meaning set apart, uncontainable, dangerous to sin. Sin, in this worldview, isn't just a personal failure. It's treated almost like a contamination, something that builds up over a year of a whole nation's wrongdoing and settles onto the sacred space itself, the way smoke settles into fabric. Left unaddressed, that buildup would eventually make it impossible for a holy God to remain among an unholy people. That is the problem Leviticus 16 exists to solve. Once a year, everything gets addressed at once. The chapter opens with a strict order about who can enter, and it starts with the animals required just to make entry possible at all. Leviticus 16 verse 3 lays it out. Aaron cannot come into the most holy place with just anything. He needs a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, specifically for himself, before he can do anything on behalf of the people. The Hebrew word behind sin offering is chatat. It doesn't just mean an offering connected to sin in a general sense. It comes from a root meaning to miss the mark, to fall short of a standard. A chatat offering exists specifically to deal with that shortfall, to cover the gap between what was required and what was actually done. Notice what this rule requires before anything else happens. Aaron has to deal with his own shortfall first. He is the one about to stand closest to God's presence, and the text refuses to let him assume his position makes him exempt. The high priest is not a neutral figure standing between a guilty nation and a holy God. He is included in the guilt. His own offering has to be made, in full, before he is qualified to make one for anyone else. This costs Aaron something specific: the comfort of hierarchy. Being high priest doesn't put him above the need for atonement. It just means he's the one required to face that need first, in public, before he can act for others. The next rule sets a boundary so strict it comes with a warning attached to it. Leviticus 16 verse 2 has God tell Moses to warn Aaron directly. He cannot enter the most holy place at all times, or he will die, because God appears there in the cloud above the mercy seat. This isn't a suggestion about frequency. It's a restriction with a stated death penalty attached. The result is that this room, the single closest point of access to God's presence in the entire nation, gets entered by exactly one person on exactly one day, one time a year. 364 days of separation for every single day of access. Compare that to how casually people often picture prayer or worship as something available anytime, low cost, always open. That picture didn't exist under this system. Access to God's direct presence was rare, guarded, and terrifying enough that the man walking in wore bells on his robe, according to Jewish tradition, so people outside could tell by the sound whether he was still moving inside. This detail does something specific to the entire nation waiting outside. It turns the Day of Atonement into the one day everything hinges on. There is no backup date if something goes wrong. No second attempt if Aaron enters unprepared. The waiting itself teaches Israel that closeness to a holy God is not casual, and that the door being open at all was never something to take for granted. Before Aaron can even pick up the blood, the text stops to describe exactly what he's allowed to wear. Leviticus 16 verse 4 lists it out: a holy linen tunic, linen undergarments, a linen sash, a linen turban, plain white linen, nothing else, and the text specifies he must bathe his body in water before putting any of it on. This matters because Aaron's everyday priestly clothing, described back in Exodus 28, was elaborate: gold, blue, purple, scarlet thread, jewels representing each tribe of Israel. On this one day, all of that gets set aside. He enters God's presence in plain white linen, freshly washed, stripped of every marker of status or office. The Hebrew word for these garments, bad, refers specifically to plain linen, associated elsewhere in Scripture with purity and humility rather than honor or display. This same connection shows up centuries later in the New Testament, where linen, clean and white, becomes the image used for the righteous acts of God's people in the book of Revelation. The standard being set here isn't about beauty or rank. It's about approaching God stripped down to nothing but cleanliness. Aaron doesn't get to bring his position into that room. He brings only a washed body and plain linen, the same uniform any purified person could wear. Before the blood does anything, Aaron himself has to already be qualified simply to carry it. Now the chapter moves fast, and this is where the number from the hook shows up. First, the blood of the bull, Aaron's own offering, gets brought into the most holy place and sprinkled 7 times before the mercy seat. Then a goat is killed as a sin offering for the people, and its blood gets the same treatment, 7 sprinklings, in the same place. Afterward, both bloods are applied to the altar outside, again 7 times, to cleanse it from a year of accumulated sin. Second, the scapegoat. A second goat is brought forward alive. Aaron places both hands on its head and confesses over it every sin of the nation, transferring that guilt onto the animal by name. It is then led out into the wilderness and released, carrying that confessed guilt somewhere it can never come back from. Third, the remains. The bull and the goat used for the blood are not eaten. Their bodies are carried entirely outside the camp and burned there, skin, flesh, and waste, in a place set apart from where Israel lives. One quick note before we move to the final section. If this kind of slow reading is helpful, subscribing helps this reach other people studying the same chapters. Every one of these details shares one function: Blood applied fully. Guilt removed completely. What's left, disposed of entirely outside the camp. Now carry each of these details forward roughly 1,500 years into a New Testament book written specifically to explain what this whole chapter meant. Hebrews. The high priest who deals with his own guilt first. Hebrews 7 verses 26 to 27 describes Jesus differently on this exact point, calling him a high priest who is holy, innocent, undefiled, one who has no need to offer for his own sins before offering for the people's, because he had none to offer for. The 1 day a year, 1 room, 1 entry. Hebrews 9 verse 12 says Jesus entered once for all into the true holy place, not a copy made by human hands, and did not need to repeat the act annually the way Aaron did. The linen and the washing. Hebrews 10 verse 22 describes believers now able to draw near, with hearts sprinkled clean and bodies washed with pure water, language that echoes Aaron's preparation, now applied to anyone approaching God through this new access. The sevenfold blood applied fully. Hebrews 9 verse 14 asks how much more the blood of Christ can cleanse, calling it blood, offered without blemish, applied not to an altar, but directly to the conscience. The scapegoat carrying guilt away. Hebrews 13 verses 11 to 12 draws the sharpest line of all, noting that the bodies of the sin offering were burned outside the camp, and that Jesus also suffered outside the city gate, for exactly the same reason. I want to slow down here, because 2 details in this chapter are genuinely debated, and it's worth being honest about that rather than smoothing it over. The number 7 itself. Scripture never states directly why 7 sprinklings specifically. 7 shows up elsewhere in the Old Testament connected to completeness, rest, and covenant, and many scholars read the number that way here. But Leviticus 16 doesn't spell that meaning out in the text. It's a strong pattern, not a stated definition, and it deserves to be held as such. The scapegoat is the harder one. The Hebrew text uses a term, Azazel, connected to the goat sent into the wilderness, and its exact meaning has been debated for centuries. Some read it as simply the goat that goes away. Others connect it to a wilderness demon or a specific place. The text does not resolve this for us, and honest scholarship admits the uncertainty rather than picking a confident answer and moving on. What isn't debated is the function both details serve. Whatever 7 specifically pictures, and whatever Azazel specifically names, the chapter is unmistakably building toward one outcome: sin dealt with fully, and guilt removed completely, with nothing left over. The details we can't fully explain still point in the same direction as the ones we can. So how does God feel about blood sacrifice? Not eager for it. Nothing in this chapter suggests God enjoyed the death required to make this system work. What the chapter shows instead is a God who refused to let sin be handled halfway. Not 1 sprinkling, but 7. Not a private confession, but hands physically pressed on a living animal's head, guilt spoken out loud, sent somewhere it could never return from. Not a body kept and eaten, but carried entirely outside the camp and burned. Every rule points the same direction. Partial wasn't an option. Sin required something complete. That's the part worth sitting with today. Forgiveness was never treated as cheap in this story. Not once. Not for Israel, and not for the man carrying the blood into that room. Something always had to fully absorb what's in cost. The system God set up shows exactly how seriously he took that cost, long before anyone understood where it was heading. Go back to where this started. 7 sprinklings, unexplained in the text, easy to skip past on a first read. But nothing in that room was incomplete. And centuries later, one final sacrifice would be offered, once, completely, so that no one would ever need to count to 7 again. If you enjoy Bible deep dives like this, hit subscribe so more people studying this chapter can find it. Drop a comment with the detail of how this makes you feel. And if someone you know needs to see how seriously God takes forgiveness, send this their way.